Yes, thank you very much for CPR for the kind invitation to moderate this panel. I'm very excited about it and hoping to learn a lot from my fellow speakers. Let me briefly introduce the speakers of this panel, panel 9, starting with Ilana Glazer, General Motors Senior Counsel, Global Purchasing and Supply Chain. Thank you, Ilana, for being with us. Nancy Dowling here, next to me. Danone North America, Vice President, General Counsel, Public and Scientific Affairs for North America. Thank you, Nancy, for joining us. Vanessa, in the other extreme of the table. King Spalding, Counsel, member of the CPR's European Advisory Board. And finally, James Riemann, Riemann ADR, CPR Neutral, and author of the award-winning book, Negotiation Simplified. Now, as for the topics of our panel today, expected disputes of 2023 and how to prevent them. The description of the panel is quite broad. Supply chain disruptions, human rights violations, climate change, financial recessions, war, all have an impact on business relationships and can lead to costly disputes and ruined relationships. Join us as we discuss the importance of dispute prevention and mechanisms that can be put in place to avoid those disputes and keep their business operating. It's a lot to cover, as you can imagine. When CPR asked me to moderate this panel, I looked at the description and said, well, that's a lot. But we decided to make some choices and narrow down to some specific topics that will, of course, cover the idea of disruption and how you prevent disputes in this arena. I want to take a moment to briefly acknowledge and thank AlixPartners for allowing us to use their report on their Disruption Index report recently published. And it's in the materials for this panel and for the conference, by the way. I encourage you to take a look. It's a great material. And they did a survey with over 3,000 senior executives around the world. And one of those key findings discussing supply chain disruptions, which is one of our topics here. In page 37, I would like to highlight at least 3 key findings. So they interviewed, as I mentioned, executives, and 93% of the CEOs interviewed stated that my company needs to diversify its suppliers to protect itself against supply chain disruption. 93% of all the CEOs heard. 90% stated that my company needs to renegotiate supplier pricing as a result of supply chain disruption. This is just came out. It's a lot. Those numbers are quite telling. And 88% of those CEOs stated that my company has entirely shifted its approach to supply chain management in the last 12 months. So everything is quite new. And the whole report saying that, you know, we should say goodbye to normal. This is the disruption age. I don't want to get depressing on the panel, but we need to deal with it as ADR professionals. So I'll start with Ilana. Ilana, we have been discussing supply chain disruption. It's one of the main concerns nowadays for corporate leadership and management. And of course, one of the potential sources for disputes this year and in the coming years. Panel 5 yesterday discussed some very important issues on supply chain disruptions. And also on Wednesday, we heard our keynote speaker, Dominic, explaining the importance of dialogue for dispute prevention and giving us a concrete example of how he applied dialogue to build stronger relationships. Now, in your experience, would you have any examples to share with us regarding the use of dialogue or other resources or tools for relationship building that has helped you prevent disputes in the supply chain context?
Yep, thank you. So I guess just to give a little bit of background, as anyone who has tried to buy a vehicle in the past couple years knows, we can't sell one or you can't buy one if we only have 97% of our parts, right? So supplier relationships are exceptionally important for us. Our plants go down if we don't have parts flowing into our plants. And from the most junior buyers in our organization all the way up through our senior leaders, working on those relationships with the suppliers is a key component of, their annual metrics of what they need to do. So we do it in different ways, and it also depends, we were talking, Raphael, previously, geographically, in different regions, relationships and discussion is handled differently. So within our global purchasing and supply chain organization, we have a strategic supplier engagement process, and we work on an annual basis with all of our suppliers with two-way communication, with surveys back and forth about how suppliers think we're doing and how we think suppliers are doing. And it's not just a purchasing function, right? So I work with our purchasing team, and our purchasing team manages that process, but it's really throughout the organization. It's how the engineers are working together. It's how the quality teams are working together. And all of that feedback goes into the survey, and at least annually, there's a sit-down between the supplier and the GM team to talk through those survey results, right? So the point, and I think, we're not there yet with, a therapist involved or, a neutral involved, to use my colleague's language, but it is done on a regular cadence, and there's scores back and forth, and, the goal is to try to just prevent issues from becoming disputes, because ultimately we need parts to flow into our plants, right? That's the goal, or that's the short-term goal, I guess. And the long-term goal is we need good relationships with suppliers so that they bring their technology to us so that parts and good products can continue to flow in and out of our plants. So the SSE process and this annual sit-down is a key. In different regions, though, there's different economic factors that play in as well. So one of the things that we also rolled out in Brazil, which I know we talked about the economic situation in Brazil also and how that's different sometimes, than the US historically. We rolled out this, we called it collaborative contract management process on, one of our programs. So how did that work? That was more formally in our contracts, right? The strategic supplier engagement that I mentioned, that's a process we use. It's not contractual, it's a carrot stick kind of thing, right? So you participate, you get good scores. If you're at the top, we reward you with a big party annually for Supplier of the Year recognition, right? So that's a carrot stick process. In Brazil, with this collaborative contract management, it's actually contractual. It's clauses in our contract that basically say, hey, give us the right pricing, give us the right process, give us what we need, we'll give you what you think you need. None of us can predict the future, but every year through this contract, we will sit down and we will discuss the book of business. And we don't make promises on anything, it's all collaborative, but we do contractually agree to sit down every year throughout the life of this contract and talk about the issues. And anecdotally, talking to my colleagues in Brazil, it has really helped because suppliers, they know that they have that opportunity to come and sit down with us, right? So because they know that meeting's coming, instead of death by 1,000 paper cuts throughout the year, you sit down and you have that meeting, and everybody brings, part of this clause requires full transparency. So they bring their business and they tell us what their issues are and they tell us where that cost pressure is, and we look across the board and we say, okay, but look at this contract and look at this contract. So the goal is contractually, it is a sit down of full transparency and figuring out what each side needs so that, as I said, parts will flow into our plants and we can put vehicles out in the field. So the collaborative contract management in Brazil, which has some unique economic factors, really has been helpful in that region. I think we do it more informally in other places, but that's contractually has really helped.
Thank you, Lena. Does anyone want to comment on her presentation? No? Okay, so I'll pass on the question to Nancy, and then we can reconvene. Nancy, still on the supply chain setting, and particularly in the current context of disruptions caused by wars and economic sanctions related to wars, in your experience, do you have any recent story to share with us on the implementation of dispute prevention tools to prevent disputes with your suppliers?
So we are a dairy and plant-based company, and we are a B Corp. So the farmer relationship is really important to us. And when you're talking about organic dairy farms, you're talking usually about relatively small farmer relationships that are very, in a way, personal. And what happened in the last year is that the Ukraine war happened. And believe it or not, about 90% of the organic feed that goes to organic cows in the US comes from the Ukraine. So you wouldn't necessarily know that, right? And so all of a sudden, the cost of organic feed skyrocketed for the small organic dairy farmer in the US. And so we really needed to work with our dairy farmers about cost on their side. We have some models. Many of the dairy farmers participate in what we call cost plus. And so a cost plus model means we factor in all your costs and there's a flat margin that is taken by the farm, and that way it tries to minimize the disruptions on the commodity pricing of milk or the commodity pricing of the components that go into milk. So what is good for the farmer is also good for us. Now, there's a cap on this because there's only so much that the American consumer will pay for organic milk. And so if organic milk becomes outrageously expensive, you simply won't have a market for it anymore. And so we need to also think about the customer and the consumer in this, because it doesn't do anyone any good, the farmer or the company, if no one is buying the milk. So I think it's a very complex set of factors, and I think it's a sharing of responsibility to deliver a very high quality product at a good price to the American consumer in a way that is good for the farmer and also good for the company. But that's not to say that's an easy equation.
Thank you. Any comments? Not yet. Vanessa, turning to you. Before that, Nancy, can you explain, you said that Danone is a B Corp. Can you explain that concept before we move on?
So in essence, a B Corp, there's two kinds of B Corps. There's a B Corp organization, an NGO that you can join, and they have certain KPIs you need to meet to be part of that B Corp organization. And it is our goal as a global company to be 100% B Corp by 2025 in every subsidiary of the company. There's also a Delaware B Corp. You can be a public benefit corporation and be registered in Delaware as a public benefit corporation, which Danone US is. And really, in essence, what you're saying is that you will consider the impact of your business on the community and your employees when you make decisions. So when we make a decision, we can't, after the fact, consider, closing a plant. What does that mean in terms of the community and the employees? We need to put that in front of our decision making, and then try to make, again, the best decision for the company, the consumer, but also the community and the employees.
And dispute prevention plays a major role in that context.
It's all about dialogue, and I think Ilana's point about dialogue was really important. I think we've heard that as a theme throughout the last 3 days. And so I think when you're a B Corp, you are committing to a dialogue. And when we talk about dispute prevention, communications is so key in everything that we've been talking about. And so when we talk about putting some of these dispute prevention provisions in contracts, what we're saying is that we're committing to a dialogue. And I think that's a pretty easy commitment from a B Corp.
Thank you, Nancy. Vanessa, now turning to you. We also heard from our keynote speaker on Wednesday a remark on the high costs of litigation in the US and the need for our legal community to try to find alternatives to that, which is pretty much in line with CPR's history and mission as explained by Alan at the opening of this annual meeting. And in your recent experience, have you been receiving requests from clients to use more tools or resources to prevent disputes? Could it be dialogue? Could it be contractual provisions? Could it be other third-party neutrals? And if so, have you been discussing or even implementing those tools or provisions, contractual provisions, to address such concerns, particularly in this disruptive context that we have been debating in this panel?
Yes, thank you, Rafael. I'm going to start with a more general remark, and that's what arose from our pre-panel call that we had a few weeks ago. I am from Switzerland. I am Swiss. I've spent my entire career working in American law firms, so I've been exposed to the continental European approach to litigation and the American approach to litigation. And if there is a clash, and if there has been a clash, I think it's still there and it's not going to end tomorrow. What is really interesting to look at when we talk about dispute prevention, dialogue, dispute avoidance, is the cultural impact of the litigation in the everyday life that you have in the United States as opposed to what it is in Europe for everyone, lawyers included. That starts from the very beginning, is that jury doesn't exist. The dockets with public access to your pleadings doesn't exist. Every submission to a Swiss court or other continental European courts are confidential. A third party without an interest doesn't have access to it. There is no judge, somebody TV or court channel. This entire setup makes it very different for businesses in Europe in their approach to litigation. They fear litigation for most of them. Now, I'm excluding to that discussion the Novartis, Nestle, Danone, all the others that have been, the Swiss banks and others that have been operating globally for years and have faced US litigation and are completely equipped now to approach that. But a traditional or a general European corporation or business will fear litigation pretty much like the pledge. For them, it's a huge nuisance, and there's no other word for it. It costs too much. It diverts the attention to the dispute as opposed to the business, and they really view this negatively. So what it does is, with this fear, it pushes Europeans to try to settle as much as possible. Of course, it's not always possible, but there's a dialogue that takes place. Now, whether the outcome is better by settling we'll never know. But there is a lot less of that threat of litigation in negotiations, and there are also approaches that are different. The construction industry, for example, which is part of my practice, the case law in Switzerland about issues relating to delays, defects, changes, etc., is very poor. Why? Because the construction industry in Switzerland settles. They settle, I would say, they estimate around 80, and of course our confidentiality that takes over all the time makes it a little difficult to articulate a figure, but about 80% of the disputes in the construction industry in Switzerland end up settled. What it brings, as opposed to the US, is also the cost of litigation, which of course is much higher in the United States. It's less in Europe, of course, because of one of the reasons we don't have discovery and the whole process is completely different. But just that aspect in and of itself is not enough. And that's a whole cultural approach that changes how the parties approach disputes or dispute avoidance. Now, what we've been doing recently, there's a lot more push for discussion that I have experienced because of everything else that's disrupting the businesses, from the supply chain problem, the remainings of COVID, and in particular in Europe, the war in Ukraine. All of this has pushed to much more discussions and much more approach to finding a solution to avoid yet another a problem for the business. In negotiations, we see that as well. When we draft contract, we revise contract, we have put a series of different clauses that have been, in the last, I would say, 2-3 years, pretty much reviewed. The force majeure that everybody has heard again and again is much more carefully looked at. We, of course, avoid everything COVID-related. We avoid everything relating to the war in Ukraine, or we call it the invasion, or the whatever you want to put the name on it. The sanction is a big problem as well, and it's very problematic for certain business. The shipping and trading industry has been extremely affected by this. The sanction packages have come in 9 packages for Europe and Switzerland, and they come in different stages. First, we have to look at the US because of the financial system, and then we look at the UK, which now does whatever it wants, and then we have Europe and Switzerland that always follows a little bit later. So all of that makes that we review the contract and we update the contract all the time because there are more individual sanctions, there are more industry sanctions. Now you can pay this one, but you cannot pay that one. And that bank agrees to cooperate, but not the other one. So that is a whole negotiation. But in most cases, it takes ages. It can be difficult. But in many situations that I have seen, it all ends up being settled. It's fierce negotiation, but we've been able to settle most of the cases for now. Now, there will always be disputes, but that's what we see. And the next issue that we have identified in our discussion and that we see in Europe, but I believe in the United States as well, that is going to have to lead to negotiations and potentially also dispute, is the move towards relocation of manufacturing. I heard, I'm not living in the US, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, the software, computer chips industry is going to relocate in part to the US. What we have seen in Europe is a big problem with drug manufacturing and supply chain problems and shortages. And the moment it hit a month ago, children drugs, that's where everybody goes pretty worried, and that affects more people, and that affects the general public when they cannot get the child drug for all the pneumonia and everything that has recently happened. And that is something that we see and that we have been starting to help negotiate, because relocating, terminating contract, all of that is a new sphere that will likely in the coming months have to be negotiating through dialogue, hopefully.
That's the topic of relocating, and it's also in the Alex Partners report. It's a topic in itself in terms of the disruptive potential, the deglobalization that's going on. Before we pass on to Jim, I'd like to hear some, Nancy and Elena's thoughts. If you have been dealing with this context of deglobalization, relocation of facilities in your work experience recently.
Yeah, I think in general, yes. And I guess I would say COVID really, you had COVID that, with lockdowns around the globe, and, there wasn't necessarily a particular moment in time, there wasn't a problem in the US, but we couldn't get parts out of China, or you couldn't get parts out of India, or wherever it was. So there'd been talk. I think that some of the legislation that has passed, that, we're still waiting for some details and regs to follow along, but the Inflation Reduction Act is also a huge policy piece that is incentivizing us, right? Because there's significant, both on the consumer side for us and on the manufacturing side, there's significant credits coming from the government. And so that has probably accelerated thought processes, or it clearly plays into decision making as to where you want to source things.
Thank you, Nancy.
And then from our side, I think there's a new emphasis on domestic supply chains in every geography. To Alana's earlier point, you're only as good as your last part of your product. And for us this year, aluminum foils became a big issue. So yeah, we could get the milk, we could make the delicious yogurt, but we didn't have a foil that we could put on the product to get it to the store shelves. So it is that last element of your product, which you have to make sure you have a supply chain that will withstand what we're seeing is ever more regionalization of the globe. And so I think there's a new emphasis in our company on the domestic supply chain.
Thank you. Vanessa, back to you. You mentioned that you specialize, at least part of your specialization is related to the construction industry, and you mentioned that most of your cases, they settle for several reasons. My question is, do you use neutrals or dispute boards in that context? Or would you consider using neutrals? Before I turn to Jim, because I want to hear his perspective as a neutral, but before that, what would be the role of the neutral there in those settlements?
I think there are two different type of disputes. The disputes in Switzerland, which would be domestic for construction projects in Switzerland, are for the most part settled. I do very little. I have done some, but few of the domestic projects, or there are larger projects that involve international parties. And in that context, I'm not going to say that 80% are settled, certainly not.
Okay.
But there, yes, there's a use of DABs and consideration of neutrals and the escalation clause that we see very often. But when it comes to Europe, in the more domestic or European domestic, the use of neutral is not there yet. Mediation is not there and not used as much. There are fields where it is used and it's mandatory, but it's not there, part of the culture again. The judges in some jurisdiction in Switzerland and Zurich and the German part push the parties to settle very strong, but they don't act as a neutral. They will push, they will incentivize them, they will say things, but they will never play the real role of a neutral, of speaking to one party and the other, etc. And there was a panel on this yesterday. I think it's part of the culture generally where when you have to go and involve the third party, you have passed one step that is part of dispute resolution that involves the vendor, that involved a judge, a neutral private party, that is not very, very familiar and that very few parties use in commercial disputes. And once I heard a counsel in the German part of Switzerland say, for my client, proposing mediation is a sign of weakness. So there is this weird approach and maybe some prejudice that needs to be worked out.
Thank you. Jim, turning back to you now. From a neutral perspective, third-party neutral, which is, I believe, most of your practice is focused in, how do you approach what I've been discussing here? What is the importance of knowing first what the parties really want in terms of managing their relationships and preventing or even resolving disputes in this disruptive context? Disruptive comes, and then they have to decide whether they want to keep the partnership, keep the JV, or terminate, do something else.
It's critical, is the short answer. I want to step back a moment. Everyone on this panel has used the word dialogue, and it's a really important word. If you look up the definition of negotiation, most dictionaries will define negotiation as a dialogue. So when we're talking about dialogue, we're really talking about a negotiation. And if you're doing a negotiation, there's a process. And a negotiation, at least as I view it, is a problem-solving exercise. And the great negotiators solve their problems by solving their counterparts. Notice I said counterpart, not opponent, not adversary. They're counterparts' problems. So what's that process? Well, if it's a problem-solving exercise, you'd think that the first step would be, what's the problem? Let's delve into the problem, figure out the economics of the problem, et cetera. It's actually not the first step. The first step, to go back to Raphael's question, is what's your goal? What are you trying to achieve? Why do we have this joint venture or this vendor relationship? Why do we select this vendor versus another vendor? What's the purpose? Goals determine everything. And I'll give you a simple example. I work with distressed companies. So I went on the board of a highly distressed public company. They had developed an extraordinary piece of technology, which was a standalone machine, and they bolted their machine onto another machine, and the combined product was really special. Their joint venture partner was a Global 50 company. This is a little VC-funded, essentially a startup. You would think that bolting two pieces of established technologies together would be simple. The manufacturers know integration is very challenging, lots of problems. And this was an infrastructure product to boot, so we're 2+ years behind schedule, cost overruns in the multi-million dollars. Everybody's going like this. I get brought in. Our company, little guy, is looking to frankly embarrass the team of the Fortune 50 company, and the economic demands that they were making were ridiculously high. On the other hand, the Fortune 50 company was embarrassed by the delays and the problems and was asking money in terms of delay damages from our company that really would have put us out of business. So my question to the board was, what do we want here? Do we want to preserve the JV, or do we want to kill it? Now, if you think about it, that's the critical question. Because if the goal is to kill it and move on, then you're really focused on money and maximizing the amount of money that you can get so you can move on. If the goal is to preserve the company, then you need to preserve the relationship, and you need enough money to keep the company afloat and moving. Completely different goal. So your first purpose is, what's your goal? And you need to define that goal with extreme granularity. Now you go into the problem-solving exercise. The problem-solving exercise usually relates to this. It's not alternate facts. It really is a difference of perspective. And how do you understand that difference of perspective? You stand in the shoes of your counterpart. You view the problem from their perspective. And then you come back with, because it's an issue of perspective, because you've enhanced your understanding of the problem, you change the dynamic of the search for solutions. So to come back to, I'm sitting here in the role of the therapist. To come back to the role of the therapist, our job is to make sure that the perspective of all the parties is understood, to keep the dialogue moving forward, and based upon our enhanced understanding of the issues from the perspective of the parties, find solutions. One more thing. It's all about people. Why do most disputes settle 5 years after the lawsuit was filed? Because the individuals that have a reputational or emotional stake in the outcome have moved up or on. So at the end of the day, what we're doing, and this is where the therapy piece is probably appropriate, is we are dealing with the emotional considerations. I'll give you another very simple example. I was in a deal where one of the parties absolutely had to close by May 15. It was a ridiculous date. It created all kinds of problems. Why May 15? It was utterly irrational. Well, it turns out that this person's bonus pool ended on the 16th. Mm-hmm. And in order to make the, individuals, okay, now once we understood that, we can figure out how to make it happen and why it's been pushed. So it all comes down to people. Companies are legal abstracts. Companies don't exist. People make decisions. People say yes or walk away. People are the ones that are going to determine whether the relationship is successful or not. And the economics of the dispute avoidance facilitator is to enhance the efficiency of the relationship, which is cost accretive as opposed to an external cost.
Thank you, Jim. Now, how would you, is this working? How would you, I heard Vanessa's words on her client saying proposing mediation would be a sign of weakness. You're not alone, Vanessa. I heard that too. Sometimes you manage to convince the client, but not the counterparty. But Jim, how would you help us, external counsel, to convince, as a therapist, to convince them that proposing mediation or any use of third-party neutrals, even as a facilitator, it's not a sign of weakness, and it's a business decision. it's cost-saving decision, it's better for everyone.
I'm going to give a lawyer answer. It depends. Every case is idiosyncratic and case-specific. But if you think about the dispute avoidance, if you think about the relationship as an ongoing relationship, we all know stuff happens. And the goal is to prevent the escalation of the disagreement into a lawsuit. So how do you do that? You do that by focusing on the goal. We've heard our GCs talk about you got to get stuff into the plant. And I was asking Alana before, well, is force majeure an issue? And her response is, that's an economic issue. That's after the fact. I want stuff in the plant, and then we'll figure out the money. So you focus on the issue, and you focus on the people, and what are the problems of the people that are relating the issue, and you solve their problems, thereby solving your own. That's the process, and it's idiosyncratic in terms of how do you execute it. But that's the overall theme.
In this disruptive context that we are discussing here, when we face disruptions, we heard Nancy, we heard Ilana, telling us, there's a sense of urgency. Time is of the essence. That you need to get those missing parts. You need to get the product to the consumer. You need to get it done, right? Wouldn't it be better to instead of just litigating or starting an arbitration proceedings, wouldn't it be better to use prevention tools and maybe hire neutrals in that regard? And that's for you, Jim. Or if you want to comment, Ilana.
I guess I would just say it's sort of, I'll take Jim's, it depends, right? So there's different types of disputes that come up in the supply chain, and I sort of refer to them as there's the day-to-day and then there's the one-off things, right? So there's the day-to-day disputes that, all of a sudden, we had a fixed price contract for 5 years, and, we had 8% inflation that we didn't anticipate, a couple of years ago, or, costs get more expensive, or, Nancy referenced the grain from Ukraine, right? There's issues that come up, and I call it, they're day to day. At the end of the day, both sides are incentivized to figure out how to solve that problem and how to solve it quickly, right? GM wants parts flowing into the plant. Nancy, you want milk, you want aluminum, but the supplier also wants to sell that to you, right? It's a win-win situation, and both sides are incentivized to figure out how to get that done, And so I think that those types of disputes or issues that arise, right, are really, the commercial teams handle it. And that's why, I mentioned our SSE process and our annual talks, and we also have, for a lot of our suppliers, we have executive champions for each supplier, right? Because we might have a supplier that supplies parts that go across a broad range of, we call, areas of the vehicle, right? They might provide across a whole bunch of different purchasing teams, but you have one champion for that supplier that sort of looks at all those suppliers' issues. And so those types of situations really depend on, to your point, the people, the relationships, the regularly cadenced sit-downs. We have some cost-plus pricing sometimes. Also, the transparency, right? Cost-plus pricing depends on transparency because
of course.
You need to, both sides, you need to be an open book on what the real costs are so that people believe you. But the places I think that we end up with mediation a little bit more in the supply chain space, I call them the one-offs. It tends to be the warranty issues. It's the force majeure after the fact, who's going to pay, right? It's the one-off things that are discretely monetary issues that are in the past, right? The parts have been delivered, the issue has happened, whether it was a quality issue that we had a recall and now it's who's gonna pay, that's just, I say just, it's a big deal, but that's just a money issue, right? So I think that's where we end up, even though our contract, even though our contracts don't require it, but that's where we, often talk to our suppliers about going to mediation. We don't generally litigate them, but we do go to mediation.
And if I can jump in, that's where understanding your goal granularly is really important, because how you settle that dispute is either going to crush the company or preserve the company or enhance the company's long-term success. So understanding what it is that you want is key and is going to dictate how you handle that mediation from both sides.
Yeah, and one point that we haven't stressed very much in the last 3 days is the credibility of the company and communication. So hardly any major thing happens in my company without me saying, have you told comms? And then we are, working with comms to make sure that the company's credibility is maintained through any kind of a dispute. And so I think that's one factor where sometimes if it's a big dispute and it's existential to the company, then perhaps arbitration is more important. But you have to consider, how is that going to play in the investor relations? How's that going to play to the media? And it's more and more something that really affects how we position ourselves in disputes.
Ilana, going back to your point on the difference between day-to-day disputes and the one shot that you might consider using neutrals or arbitration for warranties and force majeure, etc. But the other example that you gave on the day-to-day disputes resonates more to me on prevention, because you mentioned an issue comes up and you are able to tackle the issue with your supplier quickly and settle. So you don't need a neutral. But, and you mentioned that's all about dialogue and relationship, right? What's not there is that you have put an enormous amount of energy and effort and hard work in that relationship, so that when the issue comes up, you're able to manage, address, tackle it, and settle. So that work that you have been doing with your suppliers before anything is broken, that's prevention.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to have the relationship so that the other side will pick up the phone on Friday at 5 o'clock and answer your call, right? And whether it's because there was an ice storm somewhere and it disrupted, your supplier's supply chain, and there's a lot of times that the supplier can't get a product, but maybe we can get a product, or maybe we know that another supplier of ours has a surplus of something, and we can help, because it all goes back to 97% of your parts doesn't help you, right? You need 100%. So, but really, you're right. You have to, when there aren't problems, you have to work on those relationships, and you have to invest in those relationships.
And as I listen to you and Nancy, I have a sense that your companies already have embedded a prevention culture in the legal department as well. How can we help other companies develop such culture, the prevention culture within the legal department, to invest in relationships? Do you have a simple answer to that?
Well, I think there's organizations like B Corp that are out there saying that, businesses have to consider their impact on others, and that would include your suppliers. One of the reasons I really wanted to join CPR is because that's embedded in the very foundation of what this organization is. So I think, anything that this organization can do to attract new members and pass the word, I think it benefits, business as a whole.
I think the other thing is you need business buy-in, and the business team doesn't necessarily, right? So when a contract comes to me, right, my boss likes to describe himself as a marriage counselor. So when there's problems, he's the marriage counselor between the two suppliers. And I said, yeah, but we also have to negotiate good prenups, right? The contract will come to me, and they'll say, yeah, we're going to use this company, and this is really more not on the part side, but with our consultants and with other things. And I'll say, and in a year and a half from now, when you decide you want to do something else, what do we want to happen? How do we want this relationship to end? Because a lot of times it's not a one-off supplier relationship, but it might be a one-off contract with that supplier, right? So the business isn't always thinking long-term, but what the business does think about is that in terms of supplier relationships, we want to be my industry, right? We want to be the OEM of choice for our suppliers. They don't think about the problems, but they think about what happens when we have good relationships, right? If we have a good relationship, we have auto suppliers that supply to a lot of the different OEMs, and we want them to come to us first with their newest and greatest technology. And how do you do that? You do that with relationships. And so ultimately, I think it helps us on the legal side, right? You got to give the business something that makes them want to do it. They want to do it because they want the next best thing from those suppliers. But the side benefit, right? The thing that we get out of it is that they still then build those relationships and they're able to work through the current issues that arise.
If you think about it, and I'm a capitalist. Let me make that very clear. Even though I've been called a therapist, I'm a capitalist. But if you look at the data, set aside the social benefits of ESG and diversity. Just set all that stuff away. Look at the data. The companies that have diverse boards that are pursuing ESG policies are performing better by every economic metric that's out there, every single one. So you address this by looking at the capitalist economic benefits. In terms of this dispute avoidance panel, and when you're selecting who you're going to be making a vendor, you know, when I put my CEO or board director hat on, it's, okay, these are the economic advantages of this company, but do I trust them? Do I want to work with them? Can I work with them? And those are very important factors because at the end of the day, those who are much more quantitative than I am are going to put that into the economic decision-making process. And those are economic factors that need to be put into the process. Decide, am I going to work with this vendor, or am I going to work with that vendor, or this OEM or another?
Thank you, Jim. So we have 8 minutes left. I think we can open up for the audience. I don't know where the mic is. I have at least 3 questions. Just a second.
Yeah. Let me just try to project.
Please.
Stellar panel across the board. Just one brief question for Vanessa. You said that German judges may incentivize parties towards settlement. Do you have an example?
Let me think what I can share here, but what I have experienced, and I do more arbitration than litigation, and I'm also in Geneva, which is the French part, where they're a lot less efficient on that front. But I've been in courts in Basel and in Zurich, and yes, I have seen judges who basically keep the parties in the room, not lock it, but they keep them for hours sometimes and speak to them and ask questions to push them to negotiate and settle. Now it's for the parties to decide. I have seen a case, I was in that courtroom, that was extremely technical in the pharmaceutical industry, a post-M&A dispute where honestly the push of the judges for the parties to settle was prompted because the judges were completely overwhelmed by the technicality of it. And that's part of the push for arbitration, is that when it's technical, in certain countries, the judges are not specialized. But that's a side note, but basically what they did is that they listened, they asked questions, and then they look at them and said, why don't you settle? What about that figure? That was a random figure. Our client was a company with shareholders behind. There was no way you could just plainly agree to whatever the Swiss judge has suggested. But the message there was that they were overwhelmed, and a settlement was probably going to be better because the outcome of the decision was very uncertain.
We have Maurice and then Don.
Okay, great panel. Thank you so much. I think at the end, it's, in my opinion, and we talked about sanctions, inflation, war, etc., but at the end, it's the tension between enforcing your contract terms, especially when it is to your benefit, versus allowing the parties to renegotiate. deal with each and every event. And force majeure, for instance, you only get time, you don't get money. It's clear. I think the civil law contracts, there is much more room to negotiate because not everything has been taken care of in the contract. And according to European laws, it's subject to reasonableness and fairness. So there's much more room to negotiate, as Vanessa was stating. And also, unfair contract terms, because of the change in circumstances, would allow European-based contracts much more often to renegotiate, I think, than US-based contracts.
So my response to that is it's self-interest properly understood, which is you want to run your business and you can flog your supplier, but then you're not going to get your supply. So it's to the benefit of both parties, whether it's in the contract or not, to find a mutually beneficial solution so that you can run your business. And, I work with European colleagues. I think Americans can learn a lot from their European colleagues. And sometimes we overcomplexify everything. We think of every, term, synonym that we can possibly think of to put into a clause in a contract. And we don't think about the bigger picture of, we need to run the business. We need what you have, and you need us to run your business. And so fundamentally, we should be able to work things out.
John.
Okay, thank you. Is this on? Okay, great. So thank you to the panel. A great, as everybody said, a great presentation. And so I'd like to, but a lot of the discussion was in the context of the dispute has arisen. And I was wondering if, Jim, you would speak to some of the advantages of introducing the therapist, the dispute preventer assistance, into the earliest phases of relationship creation so that the parties know the person before the dispute goes on. The value, as you said, it's all about people, and how, whether that might be used, I particularly welcome Vanessa's view, and Raphael, your view on how that might diffuse the cultural resistance, suggesting that, well, once there's a dispute, it's weakness to try to talk to the other side. But if parties introduce this role, this function, into their long-term contractual relationships, where the relationship is long-term important, whether that doesn't ease some of these other difficulties of how to get it going, and who can trust who, because whether the facilitator can serve as a bridge between the two parties early on in a non-confrontational circumstance, people will perhaps get to know each other. And if I could toss in a second one, particularly to you, Nancy, I don't know anything about B Corps, very interesting, but it sounds like an area, an industry segment particularly that might be hospitable to the accepting of this concept, and whether there's some centralized organization that CPR can work with to introduce this across the B Corp front as a way of getting it accepted into industries and perhaps more exposure.
It's a really wonderful point. Yes, I think the answer is yes. And maybe, Alan, we could be talking to the head of B Corp and how the two organizations could work together. It's a really great point.
And Jim and Vanessa would like to address Don's first question.
I was actually going to pass your question, Don, to Alana. I haven't had the pleasure of being in that situation yet, and look forward to it. I can think about how I might address it. In terms of selling it, my comments are, as I said before, you've got to present it to the company as not a cost, but as accretive. And you know, how you do that obviously is case specific, but it is accretive. It's going to enhance the efficiency of the relationship. But the better people to answer your question are on my right.
The honest answer is I think it's a hard sell at the moment and is going to take some time, right? Because my business team believes that they own the supplier relationship and that they can handle it themselves. So I think it's going to take some data and some just sort of, you got to start planting seeds early and it'll take some time. I don't think it's, I mean, I think it's a good idea. I think it's worth working for, but I think it will take some time and some cultural shifting because they think they can do it, right? And so you got to get over that.
Well, Don, you asked me about it as well. My take on this is that, how to overcome resistance to prevention. My take on this, by listening, actively listening to Ilana and Nancy, for instance. For them, it's natural. So they're the ones telling us it works. It works. They've been doing that in their companies. So that's the best way to overcome resistance from other companies. And our time is up.